They laughed at my rusty old Chevy like it was some kind of joke, pointing and whispering as I pulled into that pristine downtown parking garage. The attendant's smirk was so wide you could have driven a semi through it. But when that security guard approached with his tablet glowing and those 4 words changed everything, that same attendant went white as fresh concrete. What happened next made me realize that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought in the most ordinary places by people who refuse to let disrespect slide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday morning, turning Seattle's streets into rivers of gray water that reflected the overcast sky like broken mirrors. I should have known it was going to be one of those days when my alarm didn't go off and my coffee maker decided to quit on me without notice, but I had promised my brother Jake I'd help him move out of his downtown apartment, and a promise to Jake was something I'd never broken, not in 32 years of being his older sister. My truck, a 1997 Chevy Silverado with more rust than original paint, coughed to life in my driveway like an old man clearing his throat. The passenger door had to be slammed twice to catch properly, and the radio only picked up AM stations on days ending in Y. But she was mine. Dad had given her to me when I graduated from the Naval Academy 15 years ago, back when the paint was still blue and the engine didn't sound like it was gargling gravel. I'd driven her through rain and snow, moved apartments and furniture, hauled everything from Christmas trees to motorcycle parts, and never once had she failed to get me where I needed to go. The thing about Seattle is that downtown parking is like finding buried treasure, except the treasure costs $30 an hour and disappears the moment you need it most. Jake had warned me about the parking situation around his building. The Pacific Commerce Tower sat in the heart of the financial district, surrounded by gleaming office buildings and expensive restaurants where a cup of coffee cost more than most people spent on lunch. It was the kind of neighborhood where BMWs and Mercedes lined the curbs like soldiers in formation, where women in $1,000 suits clicked across marble lobbies in heels that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I'd circled the block twice, watching meters that demanded quarters I didn't have and loading zones that threatened towing with the enthusiasm of a bounty hunter, when I finally spotted the entrance to the Commerce Tower parking garage. The sign above the entrance was polished steel and glass, reflecting the weak morning sun like a beacon of hope. Premium parking, it announced, as if parking could be anything other than a place to leave your car while you did other things. The entrance was narrow, designed for sleek sedans and compact cars that knew their place in the world. My truck, with its extended cab and 8-foot bed, squeezed through like a linebacker trying to fit into coach seating. The walls were painted pristine white, lit by LED strips that made everything look like a hospital corridor. The floors were polished concrete that probably cost more per square foot than most people's houses, marked with perfect yellow lines that could have been drawn with a ruler. I followed the spiral ramp down into the garage's belly, past levels marked for monthly parkers and reserved spaces, looking for anything marked visitor or hourly. The deeper I went, the more expensive the cars became. First floor had Hondas and Toyotas, practical cars for practical people. Second floor featured BMWs and Audis, the kind of vehicles that announced their owners had arrived in life. By the third level, I was driving past Porsches and Bentleys that probably cost more than most people's houses. That's where I found him. The parking attendant stood next to a small kiosk, clipboard in hand, wearing a uniform that looked like it had been pressed that morning. He was maybe 25, with perfectly styled hair and the kind of confidence that comes from having never been punched in the mouth. His name tag read Brandon, and he had the look of someone who took his job way too seriously, like he was guarding Fort Knox instead of making sure cars parked between painted lines. I pulled up to his station and rolled down my window, which made a grinding sound that echoed off the garage walls like fingernails on a chalkboard. Brandon looked at my truck the way most people look at roadkill, his nose wrinkling slightly as he took in the rust spots and the duct tape holding my side mirror in place. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd rather be doing literally anything else. "I need to park for a couple hours," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly despite the look he was giving my truck. "I'm helping my brother move from the building upstairs." Brandon glanced at his clipboard, then back at my truck, then at me, I was wearing my oldest jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, my hair pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to be neat somewhere around mile 5 of my morning commute. I probably looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. "This is premium parking," Brandon said slowly, like he was explaining quantum physics to a toddler. "Our rates start at $45 for the first hour." I blinked at him. $45 for 1 hour? "Premium parking," he repeated, gesturing at the Porsche 911 parked 2 spots over. "This level is reserved for our executive clientele." I looked around the garage, taking in the expensive cars and the polished surfaces, the kind of place where people parked vehicles that cost more than most people made in a year. But I also noticed something else. The level was maybe half full, with plenty of empty spaces between the luxury cars. It wasn't like I was going to be taking up space someone else needed. "Look," I said, pulling out my wallet and counting the bills inside. "I've got $67 cash. I just need to park for 2 hours while I help my brother move. I promise I won't scratch any of the fancy cars." Brandon's expression shifted from mild annoyance to something approaching amusement. He looked at my truck again, taking in the dented tailgate and the duct tape, holding my side mirror in place. "Ma'am," he said, and the way he said "ma'am" made it sound like an insult, "I don't think you understand what kind of establishment this is. Our parking rates reflect the caliber of our clientele. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in one of these surface lots a few blocks away." Heat creeped up my neck, the kind of heat that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with being dismissed like I didn't matter. I'd felt that heat before, during my first week at the Naval Academy, when upperclassmen had told me I didn't belong, that the military was no place for women. I'd felt it again during my deployment to the Persian Gulf, when contractors had assumed I was someone's secretary instead of the naval intelligence officer I actually was. And I was feeling it now, in a parking garage in downtown Seattle, because a 25-year-old in a pressed uniform had decided that my truck wasn't good enough for his precious concrete. "The surface lots are full," I said, working to keep my voice level. "I've been driving around for 20 minutes. I just need a place to park." Brandon shook his head with exaggerated sympathy. "I'm sorry, but our insurance requires that all vehicles meet certain standards. Liability issues, you understand." He gestured at my truck's rust spots like they were evidence of criminal activity. "I couldn't in good conscience allow a vehicle in this condition to park among our premium inventory." That's when I noticed the small crowd that had started to gather. A woman in a business suit was pretending to check her phone while obviously listening to our conversation. 2 men in expensive suits had slowed their walk to their cars, curious about the commotion. Brandon had noticed them too, and I could see him playing to his audience, enjoying the chance to demonstrate his authority. "Premium inventory?" I repeated. "It's a parking garage, not a car dealership." "Ma'am," Brandon said again, louder this time so his audience could hear, "I'm going to have to ask you to move along. You're blocking traffic." I looked behind me. There was no traffic. The garage was dead quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of elevators moving between floors. But Brandon was enjoying himself now, drunk on the power of his clipboard and his pressed uniform and the attention of people who probably made more in a month than I made in a year. "You know what?" I said, reaching for my gear shift. "Fine, I'll find somewhere else to park." "I think that would be best," Brandon said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Have a wonderful day." As I started to back out of the space, I heard him say something to the woman in the business suit. Something about keeping the riffraff out. Something about maintaining standards. The words hit me like a slap, not because they were particularly clever or cutting, but because they were so casual, so thoughtless. To Brandon, I wasn't a person with a name and a history and a reason for being there. I was just riffraff, something to be swept away so that better people could feel comfortable in their pristine world. I made it halfway up the spiral ramp before I had to pull over and sit for a minute. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from anger that had nowhere to go. I thought about my brother Jake, probably wondering where I was, probably looking out his apartment window from my truck. I thought about the boxes we needed to load and the furniture we needed to move and the promise I'd made to help him start his new life. And I thought about my father, who'd bought me this truck because he believed that reliable transportation was the foundation of independence, who taught me that how you treat people says everything about who you are. That's when I remembered the phone call I'd gotten 3 weeks earlier, the one that had changed everything but hadn't seemed important at the time. Jake had been excited, talking fast the way he did when he'd had too much coffee or too much good news. He'd gotten a job, he said, a real job with a real company, the kind of opportunity he'd been working toward for 5 years. Pacific Commerce Group, he'd said, executive assistant to the chief operating officer. Good salary, great benefits, room for advancement. Pacific Commerce Group. The same company whose name was probably etched in brass somewhere in the lobby of the building above Brandon's perfectly maintained parking garage. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Jake's number. He answered on the second ring, probably because he'd been waiting for me to call and tell him I was downstairs. "Megan, where are you? I've been watching for your truck. I'm in the parking garage, having a discussion with your building's parking attendant about vehicle standards and premium clientele." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Jake said, "Oh no. What happened?" I told him about Brandon and the premium parking and the insurance requirements that sounded like corporate speak for "we don't want your kind here." I told him about the riffraff comment and the audience of suits who'd watched the show like it was entertainment. When I finished, Jake was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Jake, you there?" "I'm here." And there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, something hard and cold. "Megan, what level are you on?"
3, I think? Why? Stay right there. Don't leave. I'm coming down. Jake, it's fine. I'll find somewhere else to park. I don't want you to get in trouble with your new job over a parking space. Megan, Jake said, and his voice had that tone it got when he was about to do something that couldn't be undone. Trust me on this one. Stay exactly where you are. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my truck on level 3 of the most expensive parking garage in downtown Seattle, wondering what my brother was planning and why he'd sounded like someone had just declared war on his family. I didn't have long to wait. 5 minutes later, the elevator dinged and Jake stepped out, followed by 2 other men I didn't recognize. One was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he'd spent time in uniform. The other was younger, closer to Jake's age, carrying what looked like a tablet computer and wearing the kind of expensive suit that didn't come off the rack. Jake walked straight to my truck, his face set in lines I'd only seen a few times in our lives, usually right before he did something that landed him in detention or grounded for a month. The 2 men hung back slightly, but they were watching everything with the intensity of people who didn't miss details. "Where's Brandon?" Jake asked, looking around the level. As if summoned by his name, Brandon appeared from behind a concrete pillar, still carrying his clipboard, still wearing his superior expression. When he saw Jake and the 2 men, his smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Brandon asked, his voice taking on a different tone, more respectful, more careful. "You can start," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet, "by explaining to me why you just refused parking to my sister." Brandon glanced at me, then back at Jake, clearly trying to work out the dynamics of the situation. "Sir, I explained to the lady that our premium level has certain standards, insurance requirements, you understand." "Insurance requirements? For a parking garage?" "Yes, sir. We can't allow vehicles that might pose a liability risk to park among our executive clientele's vehicles." The older man with silver hair stepped forward, and when he moved, something shifted in the air around us. It was subtle, the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself, the kind of presence that made people stand a little straighter and pay a little more attention. "Son," the man said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years giving orders that people followed without question. "What's your name?" "Brandon Hutchins, sir, level 3 parking coordinator." "Well, Brandon," the man said, I'm Admiral Robert Davis, United States Navy, retired, and I'm curious about these insurance requirements you keep mentioning. Brandon's face went through several color changes in rapid succession, red to white to gray, like a traffic light that couldn't make up its mind. The word Admiral seemed to echo in the concrete space, bouncing off walls and settling into corners like dust. Admiral, I didn't realize— You didn't realize what? Admiral Davis asked. That military personnel might occasionally need to park in your garage? That people who've served their country might not drive the newest, shiniest vehicles but still deserve basic respect? The younger man with a tablet stepped forward. Mr. Hutchins, I'm Michael Patterson, Building Operations Manager. Can you tell me which specific insurance policy requires you to refuse parking based on a vehicle's age or appearance? Brandon looked around desperately, like he was hoping someone would throw him a lifeline, or at least a better excuse. The small audience that had gathered earlier was still there, but they weren't looking entertained anymore. They were looking uncomfortable, like they'd stumbled into something that had gone way beyond their expectations. The policy states that we maintain certain standards for the premium levels, Brandon said weakly. Show me, Patterson said, holding out his hand. Show me the policy that says a vehicle with rust spots poses an insurance liability. Brandon clutched his clipboard like a shield, but we all knew he didn't have any policy to show. What he had was an assumption, a prejudice dressed up in corporate language, the belief that someone driving an old truck couldn't possibly belong in a space reserved for important people. Admiral Davis turned to look at my truck, taking in the rust and the duct tape and the faded bumper sticker with the kind of careful attention he'd probably once given to naval intelligence reports.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then he walked around to the driver's side and looked directly at me through the open window. "Ma'am," he said, and when he said it, the word carried respect instead of dismissal. "Would you mind stepping out for a moment?" I got out of the truck, suddenly aware that I was standing in the middle of something much bigger than a parking dispute. Admiral Davis extended his hand, and when I shook it, his grip was firm and warm and completely present. "Admiral Robert Davis," he said. "And you are—" "Megan Patricia Walsh," I said. "Lieutenant Commander, Naval Intelligence, retired." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that comes right before thunder, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Admiral Davis's eyebrows went up slightly, and Michael Patterson's tablet nearly slipped from his hands. But it was Jake's expression that I'll remember forever. The mixture of pride and vindication, and something that looked like he'd been waiting his whole life to see this moment. "Lieutenant Commander," Admiral Davis said, and the way he said my rank made it sound like the most important title in the world. "How long did you serve?" 12 years, sir. 2 deployments, Persian Gulf, intelligence analysis and strategic planning." Admiral Davis nodded slowly, taking this in. Then he turned to look at Brandon, who had gone so pale I was genuinely worried he might faint. "Mr. Hutchins," the Admiral said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men remember they had somewhere else they needed to be. "I want you to think very carefully about what just happened here. You looked at Lieutenant Commander Walsh's vehicle and decided she wasn't good enough for your parking garage. You looked at a decorated naval officer and saw riffraff." Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but Admiral Davis held up a hand that stopped words in their tracks. "I'm not finished. You embarrassed her in front of a crowd of people. You made assumptions about her character, her worth, her right to be here based on the vehicle she drives. And you did it all while wearing a uniform that represents this building and this company." Patterson stepped forward, his tablet glowing in his hands. "Mr. Hutchins, I need you to understand something. Lieutenant Commander Walsh's brother works for Pacific Commerce Group. In fact, he works directly for me. And as of this moment, I'm implementing a new parking policy for all military personnel, active duty and retired.
He tapped something on his tablet, and I could hear the soft chime of a system updating, of policies changing in real time. Effective immediately, Patterson continued. Any military personnel, regardless of rank or service branch, receives complimentary parking in our facility. All levels, all times, no exceptions. And Mr. Hutchins, you're going to personally ensure that Lieutenant Commander Walsh receives VIP treatment for as long as she needs to park here. Brandon nodded frantically, like a bobblehead doll in an earthquake. Yes, sir, absolutely. VIP treatment, no problem. But Admiral Davis wasn't done. He walked over to my truck and ran his hand along the tailgate, fingers tracing the dents and scratches like he was reading a story written in metal and rust. You know what I see when I look at this truck? He asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the garage. I see reliability. I see function over form. I see a vehicle that's been used for its intended purpose, that's hauled loads and traveled miles and earned every single one of these rust spots through honest work. He turned to address the small crowd that had gathered, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd given speeches that mattered, who had addressed rooms full of people whose decisions affected lives. This truck has probably moved more furniture, helped more friends, and served more genuine purposes than all the luxury cars on this level combined. And the woman who drives it served her country with honor and distinction, put her life on the line so that people like us can stand in places like this and argue about parking spaces. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word like they were hearing something they'd never heard before, or maybe something they'd forgotten along the way. So the next time any of you see someone driving an older vehicle, someone whose clothes aren't quite as pressed or whose car isn't quite as new, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that worth isn't measured in dollars or determined by appearances. I want you to remember that the person you're looking down on might be someone who served, someone who sacrificed, someone who earned your respect long before you ever met them. Admiral Davis stepped back and looked directly at Brandon, who was still clutching his clipboard like it might save him from drowning. Mr. Hutchins, I believe you owe Lieutenant Commander Walsh an apology. Brandon stepped forward. His earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of humility that only comes from being thoroughly, publicly wrong. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, I sincerely apologize. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions that were unfair and disrespectful, and I'm truly sorry.
I looked at him for a long moment. This young man who'd thought he understood the world and had just learned how much he didn't know. Part of me was angry, would probably stay angry for a while. But another part of me recognized something I'd seen in the mirror during my own early days in the service, before I'd learned that real strength comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. Apology accepted, I said. And Brandon, next time someone drives up in a vehicle that's seen better days, maybe ask yourself what story that vehicle might tell. You might be surprised what you learn. Brandon nodded, looking like a man who just received a lesson he'd never forget. Patterson tapped his tablet again, and somewhere in the building's computer system, my truck was being registered as VIP parking, Level 3, space reserved. Admiral Davis shook my hand again, holding it a moment longer than protocol required. Lieutenant Commander, it's been an honor. Your country is proud of your service, and this building is honored to have you here. As the crowd began to disperse and normal sounds returned to the garage, Jake walked over to my truck and patted the tailgate affectionately. You know, he said, grinning in a way that reminded me of the little brother who used to steal cookies from the kitchen counter. I should probably mention that Admiral Davis isn't just any retired officer. He's the chairman of Pacific Commerce Group's board of directors. He was visiting the office when I told him what happened down here. I stared at him. You mean? I mean, Brandon just told the chairman of the board that his building wasn't good enough for military personnel. I mean, he just embarrassed a decorated naval officer in front of the man who signs his paycheck.
We both looked over at Brandon, who was standing by his kiosk, looking like someone who just realized he'd accidentally declared war on the wrong country. "Think you'll remember this lesson?" Jake asked. I thought about the look in Brandon's eyes when Admiral Davis had asked him what story my truck might tell, the moment when understanding had replaced arrogance, when respect had replaced dismissal. "Yeah," I said, climbing back into my truck. "I think you will." As I drove up to the next level where Jake directed me to park, I caught sight of Brandon in my rearview mirror. He was standing at attention next to his kiosk, clipboard held properly at his side, watching every vehicle that entered his level with new eyes. And for the first time since I'd driven into that garage, I thought that maybe, just maybe, the next person driving an old truck wouldn't have to fight for the right to park where they belonged. The elevator ride to Jake's apartment felt different than it had 3 hours earlier, when this whole mess started. The same polished steel walls, the same soft jazz playing through hidden speakers, the same view of the city growing smaller as we climbed toward the 20th floor. But something fundamental had shifted in the building's atmosphere, like the air pressure had changed after a storm had passed through. Jake stood beside me, still wearing that grin that meant trouble was brewing somewhere, the same expression he'd worn when he was 7 and had convinced our neighbor's cat to wear doll clothes, except now he was 28 and worked for one of the most powerful companies in the Pacific Northwest, and his troublemaking had apparently evolved to include embarrassing parking attendants in front of retired admirals. "You know you didn't have to do that," I said, as the elevator climbed past the 15th floor. "I could have found another place to park." "Could you?" Jake asked, hitting the button for the 20th floor, even though it was already lit. "Because from where I was sitting, you were about to drive around downtown Seattle for another hour looking for a parking meter that takes quarters and doesn't have a 2-hour limit." He had a point. Seattle's downtown core wasn't exactly designed for people driving 15-year-old pickup trucks who needed to park for more than 20 minutes. Most of the street parking was either metered at ridiculous rates or restricted to residents who could afford to live in the heart of the city. The few parking lots that advertised reasonable rates were usually full by 8 in the morning, claimed by commuters who knew the system better than I did. "Besides," Jake continued, watching the floor numbers climb, "Brandon needed to learn that lesson. You should have seen his face when Admiral Davis said your rank. I thought he was going to pass out right there on the concrete." The elevator dinged softly as we reached the 20th floor, and the doors slid open to reveal a hallway that looked like something from an expensive hotel. Thick carpet, artwork on the walls that probably cost more than my annual salary, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they were ready for their close-up. Jake's apartment was at the end of the hall, behind a door that required both a key card and a traditional key to open. "Remind me again how you afford this place," I asked as he fumbled with the locks. "I don't," Jake said. "Pacific Commerce subsidizes housing for employees who work directly with senior management. Perks of being Admiral Davis's right-hand man, even if most people don't know who he really is."
So, I said, setting my purse down on the kitchen counter, what's the real story about Admiral Davis? Because something tells me there's more to this than you mentioned downstairs. Jake walked to the window and stood looking out at the water, his hands in his pockets, wearing the expression he got when he was trying to figure out how to explain something complicated. It was the same look he'd had when he was 12 and trying to tell our parents that he'd accidentally broken the neighbor's window while practicing his curveball, except now the stakes were probably higher than a $20 replacement pane of glass. Admiral Davis isn't just the chairman of the board, Jake said finally. He's also the founder's son. His father started Pacific Commerce Group in 1962 as a small shipping company. 1 boat, 3 employees, and a dream of connecting Pacific Rim countries through trade. I settled onto the couch, sensing that this was going to be one of those stories that took a while to tell properly. Jake had always been good at context, at explaining not just what happened, but why it mattered, why the details painted a bigger picture than the sum of their parts. The company grew, Jake continued, turning away from the window to face me. By the 70s, they had a fleet of cargo ships. By the 80s, they were handling logistics for major corporations. By the 90s, they were one of the largest trade facilitators on the West Coast. And Admiral Davis? I prompted. Robert Davis joined the Navy right out of college instead of going into the family business. Spent 30 years in service, worked his way up through the ranks, served in the Gulf War, commanded carrier groups, the whole career military track. His father kept expecting him to come home and take over the company, but Robert had other plans. Jake walked to the kitchen and started making coffee, moving with the kind of automatic precision that suggested this was a ritual he performed whenever he needed to think through complicated information. The smell of brewing coffee began to fill the apartment, mixing with the faint scent of cardboard from the moving boxes and the crisp November air drifting through a slightly open window. When his father died 10 years ago, Jake said, measuring out cream and sugar with the same attention to detail he applied to everything else, Robert inherited control of the company, but instead of retiring from the Navy and running it full-time, he stayed in service and hired a management team to handle day-to-day operations. Which is where you come in, I guessed. Which is where Michael Patterson comes in, Jake corrected. Patterson runs the company. I just handle Admiral Davis's schedule, correspondence, and special projects, the kind of things that require someone who understands both corporate culture and military protocol. He handed me a cup of coffee, prepared exactly the way I liked it, with enough cream to cut the bitterness and just a touch of sugar. It was the kind of attention to detail that made Jake good at his job, the ability to remember what mattered to people and deliver it without being asked. So when you called him about what happened in the parking garage, I said, taking a sip of coffee that was exactly the right temperature, you weren't just calling your boss. You were calling someone who spent 3 decades in uniform, someone who understands what it means to serve. Someone who understands what it means to be disrespected for the wrong reasons, Jake said. Someone who's probably seen his share of Brandon Hutchinses over the years, people who mistake authority for wisdom and assumptions for facts. I thought about the look in Admiral Davis's eyes when he'd ask Brandon about insurance policies that didn't exist, the way he'd spoken about my truck like it was a piece of military history instead of a liability concern. There had been something personal in his reaction, something that went beyond simple fairness or corporate policy. There's more to this story, I said, something you haven't told me yet. Jake sat down in the chair across from me, cradling his coffee cup like it was a source of warmth on a cold day. When he looked at me, his expression was serious in a way that reminded me of our father during those conversations about responsibility and consequence, about how the choices we make define who we become. Admiral Davis has a daughter. Had a daughter. Marine Corps. Killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago. IED on a convoy patrol outside Kabul. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. I set the cup down on the table between us, understanding now why Admiral Davis had looked at my truck with such careful attention, why he'd spoken about service and sacrifice with the weight of personal experience. Her name was Sarah, 26 years old, first lieutenant, intelligence specialist. She drove a beat-up Jeep Wrangler that she'd bought used from another Marine who was getting transferred. Rust on the fenders, dents in the bumper, the kind of vehicle that people like Brandon would look at and make assumptions about. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, the recognition of a story that was bigger than parking disputes and corporate policies, a story about loss and memory and the ways that small moments of disrespect could carry the weight of much larger griefs. After Sarah died, Admiral Davis established a foundation in her name, provides scholarships for children of military families, helps with transition services for veterans returning to civilian life, that kind of thing. But he also made changes to how Pacific Commerce operates, changes that most people don't know about. What kind of changes? I asked. Hiring preferences for veterans, flexible schedules for employees dealing with deployment stress or PTSD, and parking policies that don't discriminate based on vehicle appearance or perceived economic status. Jake stood up and walked to a bookshelf near the window, returning with a framed photograph that he handed me without comment. The picture showed Admiral Davis in dress uniform, standing next to a young woman in Marine fatigues. They were both smiling, but there was something in their eyes that suggested the photo had been taken during a brief moment of peace in a place where peace was rare. That was taken 6 months before she died, during Admiral Davis's last visit to Afghanistan before he retired. Sarah had requested permission to show her father around the intelligence center where she worked, introduce him to her team, that kind of thing. I studied the photograph, taking in the details that told a story beyond what was visible in the frame. The way Admiral Davis's hand rested on his daughter's shoulder, protective but proud. The way Sarah stood straight and confident, comfortable in her uniform and her role. The backdrop of sand and military equipment that spoke of a world where everyday decisions carried life and death consequences. So, when Brandon told you that my truck wasn't good enough for premium parking, I said, understanding now why Jake's voice had gotten so cold on the phone. It wasn't just about me. It was about every service member who's ever been judged by their vehicle instead of their character. It was about Sarah, Jake said simply. About the fact that if she'd driven that old Jeep into Brandon's parking garage, he would have treated her the same way he treated you. And Admiral Davis couldn't let that stand, not when he had the power to do something about it. The apartment fell quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below and the soft hum of the building's heating system. I handed the photograph back to Jake, who returned it to its place on the bookshelf with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for religious artifacts. "There's something else," Jake said, checking his watch. "Admiral Davis wants to meet with you properly, not in a parking garage with an audience, but upstairs in his office. He asked me to extend the invitation after we finished moving, if you have time." I thought about my afternoon plans, which had consisted mainly of helping Jake load boxes into my truck and then driving home to my own, much smaller apartment where the view was of the neighbor's fence instead of Elliott Bay. Nothing that couldn't be postponed for a conversation with a retired admiral who just defended my honor in front of a parking attendant with delusions of grandeur. "What does he want to talk about?" I asked. "I'm not sure," Jake admitted. But he mentioned something about opportunities for veterans in the private sector, about how companies like Pacific Commerce could do better at recognizing the skills that military personnel bring to civilian roles. It was an interesting thought, the idea that my 12 years of naval intelligence experience might translate into something valuable in the corporate world. I'd spent the 3 years since leaving the service working a series of temporary jobs that paid the bills but didn't challenge my mind. The kind of work that felt like marking time instead of building towards something meaningful. "Besides," Jake said, grinning again, "after what happened downstairs, I think Admiral Davis is curious about the woman who managed to turn a parking dispute into a teachable moment about respect and service. He likes people who don't back down when they're in the right, especially when they're representing something bigger than themselves." I looked around Jake's apartment, taking in the boxes that represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, the careful organization that spoke of planning and hope, and the belief that change could be positive if approached with the right attitude. Maybe it was time for me to think about my own next chapter,
about what I wanted to build instead of just what I needed to survive. "All right," I said, standing up and brushing imaginary lint off my jeans. "Let's get these boxes loaded so I can meet your boss properly. But first, I want to go back downstairs and check on Brandon." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Check on him? Why?" "Because learning hard lessons in public is never easy," I said, "and because someone who just had their worldview challenged might be ready to listen to a different perspective, especially if it comes from the person he wronged. You want to help the guy who just finished insulting you and your truck? I want to help the guy who just learned that his assumptions about people can be dangerous and hurtful," I corrected. "Because 3 hours ago, Brandon thought he understood how the world worked. Now he's standing in a parking garage wondering what else he might be wrong about. That's not a comfortable place to be, but it's where growth happens." Jake shook his head, but he was smiling in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely surprised by my decision. "You know, Admiral Davis is going to like you even more than I thought." "Why's that?" "Because you just proved that real leadership isn't about winning fights. It's about turning conflicts into opportunities for everyone to become better than they were before." An hour later, after we'd loaded half of Jake's belongings into my truck and arranged for a professional moving company to handle the furniture, we found ourselves back in the parking garage. Brandon was still at his station, but something had changed in his posture. Instead of the confident swagger he'd displayed earlier, he stood with the careful attention of someone who'd realized that his job involved more responsibility than he'd previously understood. When he saw us approaching, Brandon straightened up like a soldier coming to attention, though I doubted he'd ever worn a uniform or understood the discipline that real military bearing required. His clipboard was held properly at his side, and his earlier smirk had been replaced with an expression that suggested he'd spent the last hour thinking seriously about the encounter with Admiral Davis. "Lieutenant Commander Walsh," he said, and the way he said my rank suggested he'd been practicing it, trying to get the pronunciation and emphasis right. "I wanted to apologize again for my behavior earlier. It was completely unacceptable." "Apology accepted, Brandon. But I'm more interested in what you learned from the experience than what you're sorry about." Brandon looked confused for a moment, like he'd expected a different kind of conversation. "What I learned?" "Admiral Davis could have had you fired," I said matter-of-factly. "Michael Patterson could have written you up for violating company policy. Instead, they chose to turn this into a teaching moment. So what did they teach you?" Brandon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from my face to my truck to the expensive cars parked around us. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful in a way that suggested he'd been doing some serious thinking. "I learned that I don't know people's stories," he said slowly. "I looked at your truck and made assumptions about who you were and what you deserved. I didn't think about what you might have done or where you might have been or what you might have sacrificed for other people. And I learned that respect isn't something people have to earn from me. It's something they deserve until they prove otherwise." I had it backwards. I nodded, impressed by his willingness to engage with the lesson instead of just going through the motions of an apology. "What else?" Brandon looked around the parking garage, taking in the pristine surfaces and expensive vehicles that had seemed so important a few hours earlier. "I learned that my job isn't to judge people. It's to serve them, all of them, regardless of what they drive or how they're dressed or whether I think they belong here." "That's a good start," I said. "But there's one more thing I want you to understand." Brandon waited, giving me his full attention in a way that suggested he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. "The lesson Admiral Davis taught you today wasn't really about me," I said. "It was about every person who's ever been dismissed or disrespected because someone made assumptions about their worth. Every veteran who struggled to find their place in civilian life. Every person driving an older car because it's what they can afford or because it serves their needs. Every individual who deserves dignity, regardless of their circumstances." Brandon nodded slowly, understanding beginning to show in his eyes. "So when you come to work tomorrow, and every day after that, I want you to remember that your position gives you the power to make people feel welcomed or unwelcomed, respected or dismissed. That's a big responsibility, and how you handle it says everything about who you are as a person."
"I understand," Brandon said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who just realized that his job was about much more than managing parking spaces. "Lieutenant Commander, can I ask you something?"
"Of course."
"How do I make sure I don't make this kind of mistake again? How do I get better at seeing people for who they really are instead of what I assume about them?" It was a good question, the kind that suggested Brandon was serious about learning from his mistake instead of just trying to avoid getting in trouble. I thought about my early days in the Navy, when I had made my own assumptions about people based on appearance or background, when I'd learned the hard way that real strength and character often come in unexpected packages. "Start by asking questions instead of making statements," I said. "When someone pulls up to your station, instead of looking at their car and deciding what kind of person they are, ask how you can help them. Listen to their answers. Treat every interaction as an opportunity to serve someone, rather than an opportunity to demonstrate your authority." Brandon was taking this in like he was studying for an exam, and maybe he was. Maybe we all were, constantly tested on our ability to see past surfaces to the humanity underneath. "And remember," I added, "that everyone has a story you don't know. The person driving the oldest car in the garage might be the one who's overcome the most challenges to get here. The person who looks the least important might be the one who's contributed the most to making your life possible." As Jake and I walked back toward the elevator, I heard Brandon greeting the next car to enter his level. Instead of the dismissive tone he'd used with me, his voice carried genuine warmth and professionalism. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that's all any of us can ask for. "Think he'll remember the lesson?" Jake asked as we waited for the elevator. "I think he will, because Admiral Davis didn't just embarrass him, he showed him a better way to be in the world. And once you've seen that, it's hard to go back to the old way." The elevator arrived, and as the doors closed behind us, I caught one last glimpse of Brandon at his station. He was standing straighter than before, but not with the artificial authority he displayed earlier. This was different. The posture of someone who just learned that real authority comes from serving others rather than controlling them. As we rose toward the 20th floor, I found myself thinking about Admiral Davis and the conversation that waited ahead. Jake was right that the Admiral would probably want to discuss opportunities for veterans in the private sector, but I suspected there was more to it than that. Something about the way he'd defended my honor, the way he'd spoken about service and sacrifice, suggested that this was personal for him in ways that went beyond corporate policy or military courtesy. The elevator dinged softly as we reached our destination, and the doors opened to reveal the same elegant hallway that had impressed me earlier. But now, I understood that this wasn't just expensive corporate space. It was part of a company built by a man who valued service over profit, who understood that real success came from lifting others up rather than putting them down. "Ready to meet Admiral Davis properly?" Jake asked as we walked toward his office. "Ready," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was ready for. What I did know was that the day had already been full of unexpected lessons about respect and assumption, about the power of stories we don't know, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are. And as we approached the door to Admiral Davis's office, I had the feeling that the most important part of the story was just beginning.
Instead, it carried the quiet authority of someone who understood that real power didn't need to announce itself with expensive furniture or elaborate decorations. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing what appeared to be an eclectic mix of military histories, business texts, and literature. A few carefully chosen pieces of art hung between the shelves, including what looked like an original painting of a naval destroyer cutting through rough seas and a photograph of the USS Constitution under full sail. The desk was positioned to take advantage of the view, but also arranged so that visitors could sit comfortably without feeling like they were being interviewed from behind a fortress of mahogany. Admiral Davis stood when we entered, extending his hand with the same firm grip and direct eye contact he demonstrated in the parking garage. But here, in his own space, there was something more relaxed about his demeanor, as if the formal confrontation downstairs had been necessary business, while this was something more personal. "Lieutenant Commander Walsh,"
he said, gesturing toward a pair of comfortable chairs arranged near the windows. "Thank you for taking the time to come up. I know you had other plans for your afternoon." "Thank you for the invitation, Admiral," I replied, settling into one of the chairs and immediately understanding why he had chosen this arrangement. The view was spectacular, but more importantly, the seating created a sense of conversation rather than interrogation, of equals discussing matters of mutual interest rather than superior addressing subordinate. Jake took a seat slightly behind and to the side, positioned where he could participate in the conversation but also make it clear that this was primarily between Admiral Davis and me. It was a subtle demonstration of the kind of protocol awareness that probably made him valuable in his role as liaison between military and corporate cultures. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Admiral Davis asked, moving toward a small bar area that had been discreetly built into one of the bookcases. "Coffee? Tea? Water?" "Coffee would be great," I said, realizing that the earlier cup at Jake's apartment felt like it had been consumed in a different lifetime, before parking garage confrontations and unexpected lessons about respect and assumption. Admiral Davis prepared 3 cups with the kind of automatic precision that suggested this was a familiar ritual, one he probably performed several times a day during meetings that required careful attention to detail and nuanced communication. The coffee smelled rich and complex, the kind that came from beans that had been selected and roasted by people who understood that small details often determined the success or failure of larger endeavors. "Jake tells me you served 12 years in naval intelligence," Admiral Davis said, settling into his chair with his coffee cup balanced perfectly in hands that probably remembered holding everything from navigation instruments to classified documents. "2 deployments to the Persian Gulf?" "Yes, sir. Intelligence analysis and strategic planning, primarily focused on regional security assessments and threat evaluation." Admiral Davis nodded thoughtfully, and I could see him processing this information through the filter of his own military experience, understanding the kind of responsibility and pressure that came with analyzing intelligence that could affect the safety of thousands of service members. "What made you decide to leave the service?" he asked, and the question carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment, the interest of someone who understood that the decision to transition from military to civilian life was never simple or easy. I took a sip of coffee, buying myself a moment to consider how much of my story to share with someone I'd met less than 4 hours earlier. But something about Admiral Davis's demeanor, the way he listened with complete attention and asked questions that suggested real understanding, made me feel like honesty was not only safe, but necessary. Burnout. 12 years of analyzing threats and evaluating intelligence takes a toll, especially when you're responsible for assessments that could determine whether people live or die. I reached a point where I needed to step away and figure out who I was when I wasn't wearing a uniform. Admiral Davis set down his coffee cup and looked out at the water for a moment, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested my answer had resonated with something in his own experience. I understand that feeling. There's a weight that comes with military responsibility, a burden of knowledge and decision-making that civilians often don't comprehend. The constant awareness that your analysis, your recommendations, your choices could have consequences far beyond what's immediately visible. He turned back to face me, and in his eyes I saw the recognition of someone who'd carried similar weight, who understood the peculiar exhaustion that came from being responsible for other people's safety in a world where threats were often invisible until they became catastrophic. "How has the transition been? Finding your place in civilian life, discovering what you want to build next?" It was a perceptive question, one that acknowledged that leaving military service wasn't just about finding a new job, but about reconstructing identity and purpose in a world that operated according to different rules and values. Challenging, I admitted. The civilian workforce doesn't always know what to do with 12 years of intelligence experience. Either they assume it's too specialized to be useful, or they expect it to translate directly into skills it was never designed to develop.
Admiral Davis leaned forward slightly, his attention focused in a way that made it clear this conversation was moving towards something he'd been thinking about before Jake and I had walked through his door. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, what would you say if I told you that Pacific Commerce Group has been working on a project that requires exactly the kind of analytical skills and strategic thinking that naval intelligence develops? Something that would allow you to use your military experience in service of goals that matter, without requiring you to return to the stress and pressure that led to your decision to leave active duty. I felt something shift in my chest, a combination of curiosity and caution that came from 3 years of temporary jobs and unfulfilled potential. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something that could be either opportunity or disappointment, depending on factors I couldn't yet evaluate. I'd say, I'm interested in hearing more, I replied carefully. Admiral Davis stood and walked to his desk, returning with a folder that looked like it contained more than casual reading material. When he handed it to me, I could feel the weight of documents that had been prepared with serious intent and careful consideration. For the past 2 years, Pacific Commerce has been working on a veterans transition program. Not just hiring preferences or resume assistance, but a comprehensive approach to helping former military personnel translate their skills into meaningful civilian careers. The folder contained organizational charts, program descriptions, and financial projections that painted a picture of something much more ambitious than typical corporate veterans initiatives. This wasn't about checking diversity boxes or generating public publicity. This was about systematic change, about recognizing that military experience represented a largely untapped resource for addressing complex civilian challenges. The program has 3 main components, Admiral Davis continued, settling back into his chair. Career placement services that match veterans with positions suited to their actual skills rather than civilian assumptions about what those skills might be. Educational partnerships with local universities to help veterans acquire additional credentials while drawing on their military experience as a foundation. And consulting services that help other companies develop their own veterans programs. I studied the documents, impressed by the scope and sophistication of what Pacific Commerce was proposing. This wasn't a feel-good initiative designed to generate tax breaks and good press. This was a serious business venture based on the recognition that military personnel developed capabilities that civilian organizations desperately needed but often failed to recognize or utilize effectively. Where do I fit into this? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. We need someone to lead the program, Admiral Davis said. Someone who understands both military culture and civilian business requirements. Someone who can speak the language of corporate executives while maintaining credibility with veterans who are struggling to find their place in the private sector. He paused, looking out at the water again before continuing. Someone who has lived the transition personally and understands both its challenges and its possibilities. I set the folder down on the small table between our chairs, my mind racing through the implications of what Admiral Davis was proposing. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an opportunity to build something meaningful, to use my military experience in service of other veterans who were facing the same challenges I'd encountered during my own transition to civilian life. "Why me?" I asked. "You don't know anything about my qualifications beyond my military service. You don't know whether I can manage a program this complex, or whether I have the business skills necessary to make it successful." Admiral Davis smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, the expression was completely relaxed, free from the formal courtesy of military protocol or the careful diplomacy of corporate interaction. "Lieutenant Commander, 3 hours ago, you walked into our parking garage, driving a truck that most people would dismiss as worthless. When you were treated with disrespect and prejudice, you could have driven away angry and defeated. Instead, you stood your ground with dignity and grace. When the situation was resolved in your favor, you could have gloated or sought revenge. Instead, you went back downstairs to help the person who had wronged you learn from his mistake and become better than he was before. He gestured toward the folder containing the program materials. Those are exactly the qualities we need in someone who's going to help veterans navigate the challenges of civilian employment while also educating civilian employers about the value of military experience. Jake, who had been listening quietly throughout our conversation, finally spoke up. "Megan, Admiral Davis has been searching for the right person to lead this program for 6 months. Every candidate has been either too focused on the military side without understanding business requirements, or too focused on the business side without real empathy for what veterans experience during transition." "And then," Admiral Davis added, "your brother told me about what happened in the parking garage, about how a decorated naval officer was being dismissed and disrespected by someone who made assumptions based on appearances, about how this kind of prejudice reflects the broader challenges that veterans face when they try to find their place in civilian institutions." I looked back at the documents in the folder, reading more carefully now, understanding that this wasn't just about me or even about Pacific Commerce Group. This was about systematic change, about addressing problems that affected thousands of veterans who were struggling to translate their military experience into civilian success. "The incident with Brandon wasn't just about parking," Admiral Davis continued. "It was about the way civilian society often fails to recognize the value and dignity of military service. It was about assumptions and prejudices that prevent qualified, capable people from receiving the respect and opportunities they've earned." He stood and walked to the bookshelf, returning with the same framed photograph that Jake had shown me earlier, the picture of Admiral Davis with his daughter in Afghanistan. When he handed it to me this time, I understood that this conversation was more than just business opportunities or career advancement. "My daughter Sarah was an intelligence specialist," Admiral Davis said, his voice carrying the careful control of someone who'd learned to speak about profound loss without being overwhelmed by it. 26 years old, first lieutenant, killed by an IED while escorting a convoy of medical supplies to a rural clinic. I studied the photograph again, seeing new details in the faces of father and daughter, understanding now that their smiles carried the weight of knowledge about danger and sacrifice that most people would never comprehend. "After Sarah died," Admiral Davis continued, "I spent a lot of time thinking about what her service had meant, what all military service means in a country that often takes it for granted. I realized that the best way to honor her memory wasn't to build monuments or establish scholarships, though we've done those things too. The best way was to ensure that other veterans receive the respect and recognition they deserve, that their service translates into opportunities for meaningful civilian careers." He walked back to the window, looking out at the Sound where naval vessels occasionally passed on their way to and from the Bremerton shipyard. Sarah drove an old Jeep Wrangler that she'd bought from another Marine for $1,500. Rust on the fenders, dents in the doors, the kind of vehicle that people like Brandon would look at and make assumptions about the driver's worth and character. I felt the weight of understanding settle in my chest, the recognition that this conversation was much more than job opportunities or corporate programs. This was about memory and honor, about ensuring that prejudice and assumption didn't diminish the dignity of people who had served something larger than themselves. "The incident with Brandon wasn't just about parking," Admiral Davis said. "It was about the way civilian society often fails to recognize the value and dignity of military service.
It was about assumptions and prejudices that prevent qualified, capable people from receiving the respect and opportunities they've earned. He stood and walked back to his desk, returning with another folder, this one containing what appeared to be employee training materials and sensitivity guidelines. Every person who works for Pacific Commerce Group, from parking attendants to senior executives, needs to understand that their position carries the responsibility to treat every individual with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance, their vehicle, or their apparent economic status. We start by changing our own culture, then we help other companies change theirs. I opened the second folder, reading through training modules that addressed bias and assumption, customer service excellence, and the principles of respect that should govern all human interaction. The materials were comprehensive and thoughtful, designed not just to prevent incidents like the one with Brandon, but to create a culture where such incidents became impossible because they contradicted the fundamental values that guided every aspect of the organization. "This is impressive," I said, studying organizational charts that showed how the training would be implemented across all levels of the company.
"How long have you been working on this?" "Since the day after Sarah's funeral," Admiral Davis replied. "I realized that grief without action is just despair. But grief channeled into positive change can honor memory while making the world better for the people who are still living." Jake leaned forward in his chair, adding, "The Admiral has already begun pilot testing some of these programs with other companies in the Pacific Northwest. The response has been overwhelmingly positive, both from the companies that have implemented the training and from the veterans who've been hired through our placement services." "What kind of results have you seen?" I asked, understanding that the success of any program depended not just on good intentions, but on measurable outcomes that demonstrated real value for all participants. Admiral Davis walked to a wall-mounted monitor and activated a presentation that showed graphs and statistics documenting the pilot program's impact. The numbers were compelling. Companies that had implemented the veterans' training and hiring programs showed increased productivity, decreased turnover, and improved customer satisfaction scores. Veterans who'd been placed through the program reported higher job satisfaction and faster advancement than those who had found employment through traditional channels. "But the most important results," Admiral Davis said, clicking to a slide that showed employee testimonials and feedback, "are the stories. Veterans who thought their military experience was worthless in civilian life, discovering that their skills are not only valuable, but essential. Civilian employees learning to recognize and appreciate capabilities they had never understood before. Companies discovering that military-trained personnel bring leadership, problem-solving, and teamwork skills that enhance every aspect of their operations." I studied the testimonials, reading accounts from veterans who had found meaningful careers and civilian employees who had developed new respect for military service. The stories painted a picture of transformation that went far beyond simple job placement, reaching into questions of identity, purpose, and mutual understanding between military and civilian communities. "There's one more thing," Admiral Davis said, returning to his chair with an expression that suggested he was about to share something particularly important. "If you decide to accept this position, you'll have complete autonomy to develop and implement the program according to your own judgment and expertise. This isn't about following someone else's plan or executing predetermined strategies. This is about using your intelligence background and your personal experience to solve complex problems in whatever way you think will be most effective." It was an offer that addressed one of my primary concerns about returning to structured work environments. Too many civilian positions seem to involve following procedures and implementing policies without the kind of analytical thinking and strategic flexibility that had made military service intellectually challenging and personally satisfying. "What about accountability?" I asked. "How would success be measured, and what kind of reporting structure would be in place?" "Quarterly reviews with the board of directors," Admiral Davis replied. "Success measured primarily by program outcomes rather than process compliance. You would report directly to me, but with complete authority to hire staff, develop partnerships, and allocate resources as you see fit.
Jake added, "The Admiral believes that people who have proven themselves capable of making life-and-death decisions under pressure can probably be trusted to manage corporate programs without micromanagement or excessive oversight." I looked out at the water, watching a ferry make its way across the Sound toward Bainbridge Island, carrying passengers who were probably thinking about dinner plans and weekend activities rather than career decisions that could reshape their understanding of purpose and possibility. The normalcy of the scene provided an interesting contrast to the weight of the conversation taking place in Admiral Davis's office. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, turning back to face Admiral Davis. "Of course." "Why is this so important to you? I understand about honoring Sarah's memory, but there are other ways to do that, ways that would be less complicated and probably more immediately satisfying. Why choose this particular approach?" Admiral Davis was quiet for a long moment, looking at his hands in a way that suggested he was considering how much of his inner landscape to reveal to someone he'd known for less than a day. "Because," he said finally, "I spent 30 years in service, believing that the sacrifices we made, the risks we took, the skills we developed, would be valued and respected when we returned to civilian life. I believed that the country we served would recognize what we had given and what we had learned, that our experience would be seen as an asset rather than a liability." He looked directly at me, his eyes carrying the weight of disappointment and determination in equal measure. Sarah believed the same thing. She talked about coming home and using her intelligence training to work in corporate security or government consulting, about building a life that honored her service while contributing to civilian society. Admiral Davis stood and walked to the window again, his back to Jake and me as he continued speaking. When she was killed, I realized that her dreams would never have the chance to become reality. But I also realized that thousands of other veterans are still alive, still struggling to find their place in a civilian world that doesn't understand what they have to offer. He turned back to us. "This program is my way of ensuring that Sarah's dreams don't die with her, that other veterans have the opportunities she'll never have, that the skills and character developed through military service are recognized and valued instead of dismissed and wasted." The office felt quiet except for the distant sound of Seattle traffic and the soft hum of the building's climate control system. I understood now that Admiral Davis's offer wasn't just about career advancement or corporate social responsibility. It was about healing, about transforming grief into action and memory into legacy. "I'd like to accept your offer," I said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff into something that could be either flight or free fall, depending on factors I couldn't yet control. Admiral Davis smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, the expression was completely unguarded, carrying relief and satisfaction, and something that looked like hope. "Outstanding," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Pacific Commerce Group, Lieutenant Commander. When can you start?" "Monday," I replied, shaking his hand with the kind of firm grip that sealed important agreements and marked the beginning of new chapters. "But the first thing, I'd like to go back downstairs and check on Brandon one more time. I want to make sure he understands that today's lesson was about more than parking policies." Admiral Davis nodded approvingly. "An excellent first executive decision."
How we treat people when we have power over them says everything about who we are and what we value. As Jake and I prepared to leave Admiral Davis's office, I found myself thinking about the unexpected turns that had brought me to this moment. This morning, I'd been someone helping her brother move apartments, someone driving an old truck and looking for a parking space. Now I was someone with the opportunity to build something meaningful, to use my military experience in service of other veterans, while helping civilian organizations recognize the value of what we had learned through our service. "One more thing," Admiral Davis said as we reached the door. "That parking space downstairs is yours permanently. VIP access, level 3, reserved for Lieutenant Commander Megan Walsh, Program Director. I've already had Patterson update the system." I looked back at him, understanding that the reserved parking space was about more than convenience or status. It was a symbol, a daily reminder that respect and recognition could be earned through character and service, rather than wealth or appearance. "Thank you, Admiral," I said, "for everything." "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. for giving me the opportunity to turn today's incident into something positive, something that honors Sarah's memory while building a better future for other veterans. As the elevator carried Jake and me back down to the parking garage, I found myself thinking about the circular nature of the day's events. We'd started with disrespect and assumption, moved through confrontation and education, and arrived at opportunity and hope. It was the kind of transformation that probably happened more often than most people realized, if they had the courage to stand up for what was right and the wisdom to turn conflict into growth. Brandon was still at his station when we reached level 3, but everything about his posture and demeanor had changed. He stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned an important lesson and was determined to apply it consistently. When he saw us approaching, he stepped forward with genuine warmth. "Lieutenant Commander Walsh," he said, and my rank sounded natural in his voice now, spoken with the respect it had always deserved. "I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation, about the responsibility that comes with this position." "What conclusions have you reached?" I asked. "That every person who drives into this garage deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their vehicle or their appearance. That my job is to serve people, not to judge them, and that I have the opportunity every day to make someone's experience better or worse, depending on the choices I make." I nodded, impressed by his willingness to engage seriously with the lessons he'd learned. "Brandon, I'm going to be working upstairs now, leading a new program for Pacific Commerce. I'll probably be parking here regularly, and I'll be paying attention to how people are treated in this garage." Brandon straightened, understanding that this was both opportunity and responsibility. "You can count on me, Lieutenant Commander. Every person who parks here will be treated with respect and courtesy." "I believe they will," I said. "And Brandon, thank you for being willing to learn from today, instead of just being embarrassed by it. That takes character." As Jake and I walked to my truck, I felt the weight of the day settling into something like satisfaction. The vehicle that Brandon had dismissed as unworthy of premium parking was still the same rusty Chevy with duct tape holding the side mirror in place. But something fundamental had changed in how it was perceived, how I was perceived, how the whole ecosystem of respect and assumption operated in this small corner of downtown Seattle. "So," Jake said as we reached the truck, "how does it feel to go from unemployed veteran to corporate program director in the span of 4 hours?" I looked around the parking garage, taking in the expensive cars and polished surfaces that had seemed so intimidating this morning. Now they just looked like vehicles and infrastructure, tools that serve their purpose without defining the worth of the people who use them. "It feels like coming home," I said, understanding as I spoke the words that they were more true than I had expected. Not to a place, but to a purpose. To the opportunity to serve again, just in a different uniform. Jake grinned as he climbed into the passenger seat. "Admiral Davis is going to love working with you. You know that, right?" "I hope so," I replied, starting the engine that coughed to life with the same gravelly determination it had demonstrated for the past 15 years. "Because we have a lot of work to do." As we drove up the spiral ramp toward street level, I caught one last glimpse of Brandon in my rearview mirror. He was greeting another customer, an elderly man driving a sedan that had seen better decades. But instead of the dismissive attitude he'd shown me earlier, Brandon was treating the man with genuine courtesy and respect, asking how he could help and listening carefully to the answer. It was a small change, visible only to someone who had witnessed the earlier version of Brandon's behavior, but small changes had a way of becoming large transformations, especially when they were rooted in genuine understanding rather than forced compliance. And as we emerged into the Seattle afternoon, I found myself believing that today's lessons about respect and service and second chances might ripple outward in ways that none of us could yet imagine. The rain had stopped while we were inside, and weak November sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in the kind of golden light that made even ordinary city streets look like they were part of something important and beautiful. My truck rumbled through downtown traffic with the same reliable determination that had brought us this far,
ready for whatever came next. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of building a program that could change how veterans were perceived and valued in civilian society. But today, I was content to drive through Seattle with my brother beside me, knowing that sometimes the most important victories were won not with weapons or strategies, but with dignity and patience and the courage to stand up for what was right, even in a parking garage where nobody expected anything remarkable to happen.
Six months later, I found myself standing in the same parking garage where everything had changed. But this time, I wasn't alone. 12 veterans from across the Pacific Northwest had gathered for the quarterly review meeting, their vehicles ranging from pristine motorcycles to well-worn family sedans, each one representing a success story that had grown from that difficult morning when Brandon had looked at my truck and made assumptions about my worth. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Building trust with veteran communities required patience and authenticity, while convincing civilian employers to look beyond their preconceptions demanded data and persistence. But the numbers spoke for themselves now. Pacific Commerce Group's Veterans Program had placed over 200 former service members in meaningful careers, partnered with 43 companies across the region, and generated enough positive publicity to attract inquiries from organizations nationwide. Brandon had become one of our most enthusiastic advocates, though he probably didn't realize it. Every veteran who parked in the garage received the same courteous treatment he now extended to everyone, regardless of their vehicle or appearance. He'd volunteered to participate in our training videos, sharing his own story about the dangers of assumption and the power of second chances. His transformation from dismissive gatekeeper to respectful professional had become a cornerstone example in our educational materials. The real measure of success, though, wasn't in statistics or testimonials. It was in moments like watching Marcus Rodriguez, a former Army medic, receive his promotion to department supervisor at a local tech company. Or seeing Jennifer Chen, who'd struggled for 2 years after leaving the Air Force, finally land a position with a consulting firm that valued her strategic planning experience. These were the victories that mattered. Individual lives redirected toward purpose and recognition. Admiral Davis had given me complete autonomy to develop the program, but he'd also provided something more valuable than independence. He'd shared his grief and determination, allowing me to understand that this work was about more than career placement or corporate social responsibility. Every veteran we helped represented a promise kept to his daughter Sarah, a commitment that her sacrifice would contribute to something lasting and meaningful. The hardest part hadn't been convincing companies to hire veterans or training civilian employees to recognize military skills. The hardest part had been helping veterans themselves believe that their service had value in the civilian world, that the years they'd spent in uniform had prepared them for challenges they hadn't yet imagined. Too many had internalized the message that their experience was too specialized, too rigid, too different to translate into civilian success. Today's meeting was different from our usual quarterly reviews. Instead of focusing on placement numbers and partnership agreements, we were celebrating something more significant. The program had reached a tipping point where demand for our services exceeded our capacity to provide them. Companies were calling us directly, asking for access to veteran candidates. Universities were requesting partnerships to develop transition programs. Other cities were inquiring about licensing our training materials and implementation strategies. As the meeting concluded and the veterans began filing out to their various vehicles, I noticed something that would have been impossible 6 months ago. Nobody looked at anyone else's car with judgment or assumption. The man driving the pristine BMW nodded respectfully to the woman climbing into her 15-year-old Honda. The veteran with the gleaming Harley-Davidson struck up a conversation with someone whose pickup truck showed evidence of serious work miles. They saw each other as colleagues and fellow service members, connected by shared experience rather than divided by economic circumstances. Walking back to my own truck, which still bore the same rust spots and duct tape repairs that had triggered Brandon's initial dismissal, I reflected on how much had changed while so much remained the same. The vehicle hadn't become more valuable or impressive, but the context in which it was perceived had shifted completely. Now it represented reliability and authenticity rather than inadequacy and unworthiness. Admiral Davis had been right about grief requiring action to avoid becoming despair. Sarah's memory lived on, not in monuments or ceremonies, but in the daily work of ensuring that other veterans received the respect and opportunities she would never have the chance to claim. Every successful placement, every changed mind, every moment of recognition represented a victory against the assumptions and prejudices that diminished the value of military service. The program's success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A documentary crew was scheduled to arrive next month to film the training sessions and interview participants. A major publisher had expressed interest in a book about translating military skills into civilian careers. Universities were developing case studies based on our implementation strategies and measurable outcomes. But the moment that had meant the most to me personally had come 3 weeks ago, when Brandon approached me in the parking garage with news that he'd been accepted into night school to study business administration. He wanted to understand the corporate world better, he said, so he could serve people more effectively in whatever role he eventually pursued. The young man who'd once seen his position as an opportunity to exercise petty authority now viewed it as preparation for greater service to others. As I drove home through downtown Seattle, past the office buildings and shops where hundreds of veterans now worked in positions that valued their military experience, I thought about the ripple effects that had spread from one morning's confrontation over a parking space. Sometimes the most important changes began with someone simply refusing to accept disrespect, standing firm in their dignity even when it would have been easier to drive away. My truck rumbled through the city streets with the same reliable determination that had carried me through 12 years of naval service and 3 years of uncertain transition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans to help, new minds to change about the value of military experience in civilian life. But tonight, I was content to drive home knowing that Sarah Davis's legacy lived on in the work we did every day, one placement at a time, one changed mind at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. The old Chevy had become something of a symbol around Pacific Commerce Group, a reminder that worth wasn't determined by appearances, and that assumptions could be dangerous when they prevented people from seeing the truth about character and capability. Sometimes the most valuable things came in unexpected packages, and sometimes the greatest victories were won not with force, but with patience, dignity, and the quiet determination to do what was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.